Okay, so how do entire peoples become Christian? I mean, think about it. We
Yeah.
usually hear about these like individual faith journeys, right? Those personal stories,
Right.
one-on-one encounters.
hmm
But what about when like a whole community or even a whole cultural group shifts their religion?
Yeah.
It makes you think about the larger forces at work,
It does.
the unseen stuff
It does.
that influences how faith spreads.
And that's exactly what we're going to be exploring today, right?
Exactly.
You shared some excerpts from Donald McGavran's book,
Yeah.
The Bridges of God.
Yes.
Really foundational work
Absolutely.
when it comes to missionary practices.
Yeah, and McGavran had a really unique perspective, right?
Yes.
I mean, he was like a third-generation missionary in India, and he went on to establish the School of World Mission
Yeah.
at Fuller Theological Seminary.
Fuller, yeah.
So his insights really come from like deep experience and also rigorous academic study.
Absolutely.
He really knew what he was talking about. And in The Bridges of God, McGavran kind of introduces this important difference between what he calls the mission station approach.
Right.
Which is, that's what a lot of us might think of when we hear about missionary work.
Right.
Like individual conversions,
Right.
building those mission outposts, versus what he calls people movements.
Yes.
And it's really interesting because McGavran argues that this idea of people movements, it's not some new thing.
Right.
This has actually been happening
Since the beginning.
since the very beginning of the church.
Yes.
So that's really fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Yeah.
And what's also great is he doesn't dismiss the mission station approach completely.
Right.
He sees its role, particularly in the, 19th and early 20th centuries.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he really highlights this other, often more significant way that Christianity has spread through these collective turnings of entire social units.
That's so interesting.
It is.
So for everyone listening today, our goal in this deep dive is to really get a grasp
Yes.
on the dynamics of these people movements.
Right.
Why they've been so impactful.
Right.
And what they actually tell us about the relationship between faith and community.
That's right.
So it all begins with this question
Yeah.
that McGavran asks.
Right.
It really kind of sets the stage for his whole argument.
Yes.
And he says, how do clans, tribes, castes, in short, how do peoples become Christian? And he makes it clear, right?
Yeah.
That this isn't just some like theoretical question for academics.
Yeah.
It's a question for anyone
That's right.
who's interested in how the Christian church lives and grows.
Absolutely.
And this raises like a really key point.
Yeah.
I mean, why is this whole group dynamic thing kind of hard to see for a lot of us?
Yeah.
Especially in the West.
Right.
And McGavran argues, it's our Western societies.
Right.
It's heavy emphasis we have on individualism. It makes it harder to spot these collective shifts.
Yeah.
You just don't have as many of those really tight-knit, exclusive social groups that you see elsewhere.
That's right.
Yeah. And, I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
In lots of Western societies, there's a ton of social nobility.
Right.
Right?
Right.
People are interacting across different social circles, and there's this huge value placed on individual autonomy.
Yeah.
Freedom of conscience.
Right.
Like, you might have people in the same family
Yeah.
with totally different religious beliefs.
Sure.
And yeah, it might cause some disagreements here and there,
Yeah.
but it's generally accepted.
That's right.
That's just how it is.
Yeah. And if we think about
Great.
a broader historical trend here,
Yeah.
the Industrial Revolution in the West had a massive impact on breaking up those traditional family and community structures. People moved to cities.
Right.
Families ended up scattered all over the place.
Yeah.
And this really cultivated this idea of making decisions on your own.
Yeah.
And naturally, that extends to religious choices.
Absolutely.
And then McGavran talks about revival meetings, which have been such a big part of Western Christianity.
Yeah.
And while they've led to many genuine conversions, he points out, they often stressed individual commitment.
Yeah.
Sometimes even like putting a decision made against family wishes above all else.
He uses the word dubious to describe that.
He does.
Which is really interesting.
It really highlights his perspective,
Yeah, it really does. And it underscores this idea that from a Western viewpoint, we tend to see peoples as just like collections of individuals.
Yeah.
And we often miss that social organism aspect, as McGavran calls it. So let's dig into that a bit more.
Okay.
When McGavran says true people, What does he actually mean by that?
Yeah.
It's more than just a random group of individuals.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
For McGavran, a true people is this social unit.
Okay.
Where the most important relationships is marriage, close social interaction, a sense of belonging, shared identity. Those things mostly happen within that group.
Right.
It's a shared, intimate life lived within those boundaries, those social parameters.
He even says that this can create a sense of a distinct race in their minds.
He does.
Even if they aren't biologically different.
Right.
That's a powerful way to think about it.
It is. And it leads to a point he makes about race consciousness, which is interesting. He argues that missionaries, sometimes they viewed this negatively as like a form of prejudice to overcome.
Right.
But McGavran suggests that this sense of shared identity within a group, it can actually be a good thing.
You know, an ally in the process of Christianization.
Yeah.
If it's understood and approached the right way.
So that really challenges some assumptions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So if that's what a people is to McGavran, what's the biggest mistake to avoid when you're trying to share Christianity with them?
The biggest mistake is snatching individuals out of their social context.
Right.
With the goal of eventually Christianizing the whole group.
Okay.
He talks about Bishop J.W. Pickett's observations in India.
Okay.
Where this extracting of individuals from Hindu or Muslim communities, it didn't lead to widespread church growth.
Interesting.
Instead, it often caused a lot of hostility and created big obstacles for the gospel.
And it's not just about how the wider community reacts.
Right.
Right.
It's not.
There are serious consequences for the individuals, too.
Yes, absolutely.
Who are taken out of their social fabric.
These individuals often lose the support
of their family and friends. They become reliant on the mission for their social needs and their ability to connect with and influence others within their own people group. It diminishes significantly.
Wow.
McGavran describes these isolated converts as forming anemic churches.
Interesting.
They lack strong leadership from within.
Right.
And they're overly dependent on outside support.
So the key point here is that extracting individuals creates dependence.
It does.
And hinders that organic growth.
Yes.
And ultimately, it undermines the goal.
That's right.
Of a self-sustaining church that multiplies.
A church that can reproduce itself, yes.
But McGavran's not saying individual conversion is bad.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Okay.
He's clear that personal conversion is essential.
Right.
That one-on-one encounter with Christ and accepting him.
Yeah.
He even references Colossians 3.12 about setting our hearts and minds on things above.
Right. But the point is, this personal transformation needs to happen while the individual is still connected to their people.
Right. Still within that group.
Yes.
So instead of focusing on like isolated individuals, we need to understand this idea of the group mind.
Yes.
Another key concept from McGavran.
Yes.
So what does he mean by that?
Well, in many non-Western societies, the individual is just much more deeply embedded in the group. So if they do something on their own, without talking to the group, that can be seen as like a betrayal.
Wow.
As treachery.
Okay.
McGavran puts it that way.
Yeah.
Decisions about big life events, like business, marriage, personal problems.
Yeah.
Those decisions are made together.
Right.
Through discussion and trying to reach a consensus.
It's very communal.
Yeah. In many cultures, especially those with strong communal traditions, the individual is just much more a part of the social fabric. So when it comes to like a huge shift, like changing your religion, it's not just a bunch of individuals saying, yes, I believe in Jesus.
It's not. McGavran says that a group decision to accept Christianity, it's way more than just adding up individual choices.
Right.
It's like this prolonged informal vote-taking.
Interesting.
This gradual shift in what the community agrees on. People think about it. They discuss it.
Right.
They see how much agreement there is within the group. There's this momentum building towards a collective decision.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And he also points out that these peoples, they're not always one big block.
Right.
There can be smaller groups within the larger group.
Subgroups, yeah.
So how do those smaller units play into these group decisions?
That's a great point and an important nuance.
Yeah.
Often the movement towards Christianity starts in these smaller, more tight-knit groups. Okay.
Maybe it's family ties, or they live near each other, or they do the same kind of work.
Yeah.
These subgroups become like catalysts.
Right.
They influence and lead the larger group.
So that all leads to McGavran's definition of people movements. So can you just put that in simple terms for us?
Sure. McGavran defines a people movement as a wave of decision for Christ that sweeps through the group mind. It involves lots of individual conversions, but fundamentally it's a collective thing, impacting the whole social unit.
Okay, so he contrasts this with that prevailing missionary strategy of the 19th century, what he calls the exploratory mission station approach. And this was set against what Kenneth Scott Latourette called the Great Century of missionary expansion.
That's right.
So what was so unique about that time?
Well, Latourette called the period from 1800 to 1914
the Great Century, because Christianity was spreading globally at a pace never seen before.
Wow.
Despite some big challenges, the West was becoming more influential. Missionaries were venturing into cultures that were so different from their own.
Right. And McGavran points out this huge gulf of separation that existed between these Western missionaries and the people they were trying to reach. It wasn't just about different religious beliefs, right?
It was a much bigger gap. These missionaries, they usually came from wealthy, literate, industrialized societies. And many of the people they wanted to reach lived in poverty, couldn't read, and had very traditional ways of life. McGavran calls them medieval and agricultural contexts.
I mean, think about the differences in standards of living, transportation, even basic things like what they ate.
There's huge difference.
In context meant that this model of individual uplift, which was common in the West, faced some pretty big hurdles.
Absolutely. And the missionaries often lived with a level of comfort that the local people couldn't even imagine.
That's right.
Even something as simple as their skin color made them stand out.
It created a visible difference.
And that must have added to the feeling of distance.
Absolutely.
And unlike the early church, where Christianity spread through social networks, family ties, trade routes, these 19th century missionaries, they didn't have those bridges.
They didn't.
There weren't already Christian relatives or those deep social connections.
McGavran talks about the things they did do, learning the language, helping out, educating people. He calls those casual contacts. Not those deep organic connections needed for a widespread movement.
So to deal with this gulf of separation,
they came up with the exploratory mission station approach. And that became the main strategy. So what did that look like in practice?
It was all about setting up a physical mission. Getting land. Putting up buildings like houses, churches, schools, hospitals.
So a real hub.
Yes, a central hub for their activities.
And it sounds like a lot of these early converts, they ended up pretty isolated from their families and communities.
That's right.
Because if you became Christian, it often led to you being pushed out of your social circle. So people had to leave their homes, and they had to rely on the mission for housing jobs, even just to have people to talk to. So orphans, former slaves people, healed at mission hospitals. They often ended up living in the mission compound.
They formed this gathered community.
It seems like the idea was that these mission stations would spark this mass ingathering. But McGavran suggests that didn't always happen.
It didn't, and he points out that it actually had a consequence that wasn't intended.
What's that?
These converts started to feel like they had joined another race.
Wow.
So that alienated them even more from their own people. And that created another obstacle to spreading the faith.
So what about the churches that came out of this approach? These gathered colony churches, as he calls them.
They were typically made up of individuals who had been transformed, and they often had more education than the general population.
That's right.
They formed well-organized congregations with their own buildings.
And trained pastors.
Okay, so that sounds good.
Yeah.
So what were the limitations?
The main limitation came from that initial separation from the original communities, these converts and their kids. They developed this sense of being different.
Sometimes even better than their non-Christian relatives.
Interesting.
Future generations in these mission-founded churches, they became more and more disconnected from the wider society. They often married within their own small group. And that really limited their reach, right?
McGavran even mentions that they sometimes didn't rely on God's power as much. Maybe because they were leaning more on the education and resources they got from the mission. And in some cases, these churches became resistant to growing. They were afraid that new converts who might be less educated or refined would drain resources or lower their status.
It's a fascinating observation, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he also points out their dependence on money and staff from foreign missions to do even basic things.
So they weren't really set up for that kind of wide-scale growth that happens organically within a society. And this brings us to the other model. What McGavran calls God-given people movements.
That's right.
So what were the key features of these movements?
Well, McGavran contrasts that slow growth of the mission station approach with these people movements to Christ. Which are often more spontaneous, unexpected. And he emphasizes that these movements, even though they were sometimes ignored or even met with doubt, they account for the vast majority, over 90% of the growth of newer churches around the world.
That's amazing.
It is a surprising statistic, isn't it?
Yeah. And he gives some really good examples.
He does.
Like the Karen movement in Burma, which started with this guy, Kotabu, who people didn't really take seriously at first.
That's right.
Yeah, Adoniram Judson, the big missionary in Burma at the time, he was focused on the Buddhist Burmese people. And he saw Kotabu, who was this former criminal from a tribe considered stupid by many as like a side project. But it was among the Karen people that this huge lasting movement towards Christianity started.
That's right. And it shows how God's work can often show up in the most unexpected places. And among people who are underestimated. So what does that tell us about assumptions in missions, about looking past first impression?
Absolutely.
And then there's the Chura movement in Pakistan, where a whole untouchable community converted. And their social standing completely changed.
And even there, the missionaries were hesitant at first.
They were.
That shows how these movements can bring not just spiritual transformation, but social change too. Uplifting marginalized groups.
And the missionaries' hesitation, it shows how sometimes they didn't understand these large-scale group conversions because of their own individualistic ideas about faith.
And then there's the fast growth of Christianity through these movements in Indonesia. Like with the Bataknias and Minahasa people, and the significant movements across Africa. It seems like there's this different kind of engine driving church growth there.
These examples show the huge scale and impact of people movements. In Indonesia, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, even millions, turning to Christianity really fast. And McGavran says that future church growth in sub-Saharan Africa will likely be driven by these movements within tribal and ethnic groups.
So the churches that come from people movements, how do they compare to the mission station churches?
They tend to have lots of congregations, often led by pastors with less formal training and meeting in more simple buildings. But McGavran emphasizes their resilience. And stability, even when they face persecution. And he attributes that to the strong social connections in these communities.
It's like the faith is woven into the social fabric, making it tougher to be torn apart by external pressure.
That's a good way to put it.
McGavran uses this phrase, unvalued pearls.
He does.
To describe how these movements were often seen by church and mission leaders. Why do you think they weren't appreciated?
McGavran says it's that Western emphasis on individual decision-making that led to people being suspicious or just not understanding these group conversions. Leaders questioned if the faith was real when it happened collectively.
Because it was missing that individual story of faith.
Exactly.
It makes you think.
It does.
What if they'd focused on these movements from the very beginning of missions?
What if?
And then he lists 5 great advantages of people movements.
He does.
So let's go through those.
Okay.
The first is the creation of permanent indigenous churches that don't rely on Western missions.
Yes.
They're rooted in the local culture, self-sufficient, not always needing money from overseas, and their faith has been tested through persecution.
They've been through the fire.
They really belong to the people.
They do.
The second advantage is their natural connection to the local culture.
Yes.
So they can keep their customs, which is different from the mission station approach.
Right. Where sometimes converts would adopt Western ways. So in people movements, things like clothing, food language, even traditional arts can be part of their Christian faith.
So the interconnectedness is key.
It is.
You don't have to abandon your culture.
That's right.
To embrace the faith. The third advantage is this spontaneous expansion.
Yeah.
This reminds me of what Roland Allen talked about.
Absolutely.
Because these new Christians are still in their social networks.
Yeah.
It's natural for them to share their faith. With family, friends, and neighbors.
It comes from those existing relationships.
And McGavran contrasts that with top-down, foreign-led expansion, which might not be sustainable. The fourth advantage is the potential for huge growth.
Yes.
Both internally and externally. So internally, there might be people within the movement who haven't become Christian yet. So there's opportunity for evangelism within the group.
With the same social unit.
And externally, these movements can connect with other communities.
They can act as bridges, yes.
McGavran uses the example of the Megagas in India. And how there could be similar movements all over the world where that group is present.
He points out that these times of rapid growth, they often last about a generation.
Wow.
Yeah.